Hi everyone, this is Gail Peter Borden and I'm coming to you from my studio in Houston, Texas to answer some questions about my work with Galleri Urbane and my upcoming show, Spaced. So the concept of materiality has been very influential in my work as both an artist and an architect. The idea that what we make something out of influences what we make and how we make it is paramount to thinking about the built environment, objects, their legacy as kind of the results of actions, activities, and ultimately our processes with matter, materiality at its fundamental level is really essential. So though the work at Galleri Urbane is largely what one would call two-dimensional, probably in a painting category, I still very much think of them as three-dimensional objects. They set up a deep cradle. They use ideas about perspective to imply space, the use of color, and ultimately the kind of cast resin process in addition to the acrylic paint becomes really essential to how we perceive the individual understanding of each composition. So materiality in both art and architecture is a kind of point of departure and a sort of essential quality to everything I make. So this show also includes a sculptural floor piece. It picks up on many of the same techniques as the resonant panels. It uses a kind of singular family of colors and a kind of various gradients to begin to define either protruding or recessional volumes. Using kind of cast concrete tiles that are hooked together into a kind of linear line. There's an idea about segmentation and individuation of each piece, but a kind of aggregation of them as they begin to establish a line across the floor. Each panel then has a 3D printed frame piece that makes the two-dimensional, even though it's physically two-dimensional on the floor, truly three-dimensional, adding the kind of z-axis with the kind of protruding frames. Those become iconic kind of profiles of forms and ultimately really geometries that are line-based, that through projected light then also create a secondary shadow. So the idea of the object becoming dimensional establishes a kind of whole other reading and realm as it projects both conceptually as well as literally. So the modularity in the works that I've allowed paintings to be kind of arranged and rearranged in different configurations and grouping is something that definitely has resonated in the work in recent years. That flexibility is built into many kind of understandings of the material process and the ability to control casts on a certain kind of scale. If that becomes modularized, like bays of construction, then there's the ability to kind of phase that and the resonance of control into the idea of scale. But equally important is the idea of the economy, that the artwork grows over time, people's means grow over time, the ability to add or take away, to compose and recompose. And then all of that to collaborate with an idea of contextuality, the context of a specific place, the idea that the canvas is not about just an interior world, but about how an object sits on a larger wall within a space or a room, and how those all begin to relate allows for a kind of customization to the specifics of place, but also the viewer, the panels that people respond to, both compositionally or in terms of color, it allows for a kind of collaborative method where the art is not just top down as a preconceived object, though it does exist that way in each module. It allows for a sort of secondary reading and a kind of quilting that can occur that provides an additive idea of form and place and, again, contextual response. So for me, again, modularity is kind of an exciting venue. It probably comes out of, again, that synthetic idea of art and architecture, material and process, and how things are made. Color really plays an integral role in my work. There's really a fundamental sort of reliance on the idea of color as field in very primitive geometries to begin to establish kind of formal compositions. So the use of color is, though actually researched in a very kind of heavy way about color theory, what that's meant to modernism, and ultimately kind of everything from Albers to contemporary thoughts on the use of CMYK versus RGB relative to kind of digital ideas of color. For me, there's a more intuitive kind of play. There are colors that work together. There are colors that work against each other, a kind of visual resonance, a sort of happy circumstance. The process by which I work, actually, they all begin as kind of sketches and drawings. There's kind of color studies done through paint samples and even kind of resin cast fields. The way light refracts through the depth of the resin changes the kind of pigmentation. And then there's the adjacency of color, which creates kind of reverberation and a sort of optical resonance, which is really specific to kind of each precise composition. So color is kind of something that makes me very uneasy, but also very excited in that it's a sort of moment of discovery and sort of working. Many of the panels, as you'll see, work in kind of familial tones, so gradients within one color family, and then often a kind of accent element that tries to sort of break that. That complexity is sort of further taken on when there's been aggregated panels that move across a variety of color families, and the kind of composition, the dominance, the scale of each individual tone then sets in play a kind of dialogue. So I use a lot of color. I don't use a lot of color in that I think I have sort of favorites and friends that I come back to, tones that I try to reproduce, but the kind of variant of composition and juxtaposition become major kind of collaborators. So the Pixelated Aggregate series is a kind of new scale that I've been working with over the last year and a half. The idea of doing cellularized works that are more intimate in scale and then having the capability of them to aggregate into larger compositions comes from a desire for the composition to expand beyond a kind of single panel, to engage the fullness of a wall, to become somewhat site-specific and kind of contextual, to put the viewer or the owner into a kind of collaborative dialogue so that there's the ability for compositions to emerge out of a kind of an instinctual play of not just the artist but also the viewer in terms of what panels they respond to, how they buy them, where they install them. There's an economy to it in terms of breaking down the panel and the ability to grow a piece over time or to add to a piece as one kind of wants to or can afford to. The Pixel series I call is that because they go to a much smaller module, instead of working off a 12-inch module, start working off a 6-inch module. So it's 6x6, 6x12, 6x18s, 6x24s, and they then begin to create within themselves a kind of cluster. So the idea of a more specific composition, but working across a variated boundary, then establishes a kind of new way of working that has been previously much more monumental in scale and now can become kind of intimate. So for me, they're finished works, and that they're very intended to be at that scale, but they're almost like maquettes for much larger pieces. Studying again the interplay of the kind of overall composition of frames relative to the internal world compositions within each frame.